In the fall of 1838, a young girl named Matilda Lockhart faced an unimaginable ordeal. Along with 4 other children, all her neighbors, she was out harvesting pecans near her home on the Guadalupe River, close to what is now DeWitt, Texas. This peaceful moment of childhood innocence was shattered when they entered a clearing and were confronted by a vast sea of horses, each ridden by a Comanche warrior. Their faces painted, and their presence a stark reminder of the land's deep history. Matilda, just 14 years old, was the eldest among the children. As soon as she saw the warriors, a deep instinct kicked in. She dropped her pecan bucket and fled, running as fast as she could toward home, hoping to escape the danger that had arrived so suddenly. But in the distance, the cries of the other children echoed through the air, pulling at her heart. She couldn't leave them behind, and in that moment of hesitation as she turned back to help, she made a critical mistake. The Comanche had already surrounded the others, tying them to their horses. Matilda's fate was sealed as a warrior rode up to her. She knew then what was coming. She was about to be taken by the Comanche. This was no random act. The capture of Matilda Lockhart and the other children would ignite a series of events that would fuel one of the most violent and tragic blood feuds in the history of the American West. The Comanche, fierce protectors of their land and their people, were often misunderstood, seen by many as ruthless and savage. Yet to them, these actions were rooted in their own survival and their deep connection to the land they had roamed for centuries. For the people of Texas, the event was nothing short of devastating. The fear, anger, and helplessness experienced by the families would only grow in the years that followed, feeding a relentless cycle of violence between 2 cultures, each desperate to protect their own way of life. The events set in motion by Matilda's capture were more than just a tale of loss. They were the beginning of a fierce conflict that would echo through the generations. In February of 1839, just months after the capture of Matilda Lockhart, a company of 63 Texans, led by Colonel John Moore and 16 Panapache warriors, embarked on a treacherous journey into the heart of Comancheria. Their mission? Retaliation for the recent raids and kidnappings that had struck fear into the hearts of settlers across the region. But this was not just a simple retaliation. It was a punitive expedition, a desperate attempt to assert dominance and punish the Comanche for their resistance. The Texans had already learned the hard way that their previous attempts to negotiate with the Comanche had failed. They were dismissed, ignored, and bypassed by the Comanche warriors, whose mastery of mounted warfare made them nearly unbeatable. With their pride on the line, the young leadership in Texas believed a show of force was necessary, a force that could catch the Comanche off guard in their own territory. They followed the Colorado River northwest, hoping that surprise would give them the edge. But the journey was grueling. They were battered by relentless northers, harsh winter storms that froze their bones and killed several of their horses. The farther they traveled, the more their hopes seemed to dwindle. Their Apache guides, bitter enemies of the Comanche, had lost the trail in the blinding snowstorm. With each passing day, the fear grew stronger. They might never find their target. Then, a faint sign in the distance, a wisp of smoke rising from campfires, gave them new hope. It was a signal that the Comanche were near, but it also brought a new layer of dread. They had come so close, but now they were teetering on the edge of danger. As the night fell, the tension in the air was palpable. Every sound seemed magnified in the stillness. Noah Smithwick, one of the rangers traveling with the group, recalled the chilling experience. While riding along about dark, we heard a wolf howl behind us. My guide stopped short and assumed a listening attitude. In a few moments, another answered, way to the right. Still, the Indian listened so intently that his form seemed perfectly rigid. Then another set up a howl on our left. "Oomph, Bobo," said the live pan in a tone of relief. Smithwick, uneasy himself, noted that the sound of the wolf never felt more unnatural. He couldn't help but feel a creeping dread. He realized that even the Apache, who had fought countless battles with the Comanche, were uncertain whether the sounds they heard were wolves or warriors preparing to strike. The cold chill of uncertainty gripped everyone, their senses alert, their minds racing, fully aware that death could come swiftly and silently. This moment, an eerie blend of nature's unpredictability and the tension of impending battle, exemplifies the constant mental and physical strain that the Texans faced in their pursuit of the Comanche. The sound of the wolf's howl, unsettling and discordant, became a symbol of the fear and confusion that lay ahead, as the two sides were drawn inexorably toward a confrontation that would shape the fate of the region. Moore gave the order attack. The Texans, moving swiftly, crept upon the sleeping Comanche. As soon as they reached the village, they fired a volley straight into the lodges. The Comanche, still half dazed from sleep, had no time to respond. Women and children screamed in terror, dogs barked, and the men scrambled to defend their families. Smithwick wrote about the chaos that followed. "We then crept upon the sleeping Indians, who were not dreaming of an attack. As soon as daylight gave us the exact situation of the camp, we made a rush for it, pouring a volley right into the lodges. Taken completely by surprise, the savages bounded from their lodges and scattered like partridges. Our men rushed right in among the lodges, the women and children screaming, dogs barking, men yelling and shooting, in a moment transformed the peaceful scene on which the day had but just dawned into a pandemonium. The attack had been a success, but not without its cost. The Comanche, stunned by the onslaught, were forced to flee, but not before they suffered casualties. As Andrew Lockhart, Matilda's father, searched through the camp for his daughter, the Texans found themselves deep inside enemy territory, their lines beginning to blur in the confusion. But the chaos wasn't over. As the Comanche scattered, Moore saw the disarray among his own troops and feared the possibility of friendly fire. In that moment, he made the decision to call for a retreat, unwilling to risk further losses in a situation that was quickly spiraling out of control. Had Moore continued his advance, he may have been able to fully capitalize on the disorganization of the Comanche and prevent their escape. But the fear of further casualties forced him to make a difficult choice, one that ultimately allowed the Comanche to regroup and avoid complete defeat. The panic that followed, as Smithwick described it, was like the scattering of partridges, quick, desperate, and chaotic. The Comanche warriors had fled the initial surprise, but in doing so, they rushed straight for their horses, their ultimate weapon. The Apache scouts, who had been tasked with stampeding the horses to prevent a quick escape, failed in their mission. Within moments, dozens of Comanche warriors were mounted and ready for battle. The Comanche were deadly on horseback, an unmatched force in the art of mounted warfare. With their expert use of the bow and the agility of their horses, they could fire arrows with precision and speed that no white man armed with a muzzleloader could ever hope to match. Worse still, Moore's men had left their horses behind, choosing to advance on foot in the hope of catching the Comanche off guard. Now they found themselves stranded and vulnerable. The Comanche quickly circled the Texans, their mounted warriors moving with practiced ease. It became clear to Colonel Moore just how dangerous it was to make a mistake when facing such a formidable enemy. What had started as an overwhelming victory for the Texans now had the potential to turn into a complete disaster. The Comanche were closing in, but the Texans were not yet finished. The only thing that saved them from total annihilation was a cedar break, a natural break in the landscape that provided a momentary shelter from the storm of arrows and hooves. Moore's men huddled together, rifles in hand, using them as deterrents to keep the Comanche at bay. The Texans had a slight advantage. They could defend from a position of cover, while the Comanche could not easily close the gap. If the Comanche had chosen to pursue, they would have easily overwhelmed the small force of Texans. But the Comanche did not. Their methods of warfare were not born of mindless aggression, but of strategic wisdom. They understood the risks of attacking a fortified position. Unlike the white man, who often relied on fixed defenses and brute force, the Comanche did not fight for the sake of fighting. They fought for advantage. In this moment, the Comanche knew that attacking the Texans would cost them more than it was worth. They were calculating, waiting for the right opportunity to strike, and understanding that retreating from a fortified position was not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. Their ability to strike swiftly, from multiple directions, and when least expected, made them an unpredictable force. The Texans were, in this instance, at their mercy. For a time, the Comanche tested the resolve of the Texans with a series of bluff charges. They charged but did not engage, attempting to make the Texans retreat. However, when they saw that the Texans remained steadfast in their position of cover, the Comanche ultimately chose to move on, an action that can be seen as an act of mercy. For a while, the Comanche performed bluff charges, but unable to get the Texans to leave the area of cover, they eventually moved on, an act of mercy. This choice speaks volumes about Comanche strategy. They never wasted their resources on unnecessary violence when it wasn't needed. After the Comanche pulled back, Colonel Moore and his men were lucky to be alive. The Texans, weary and humbled by the encounter, weren't ready to face the Comanche again. They were lucky to be alive and not ready to fight the Comanche. The defeat at the hands of the Comanche warriors, who were unmatched in mounted warfare, revealed a stark reality. Texas forces were simply no match for the Comanche in this moment. Despite their numbers, the Texans faced a serious gap in experience and combat ability. From 1836 to 1840, after Texas had declared its independence, the settlers had constantly been at the mercy of Comanche raids. These raids were a painful reminder that the Texans had underestimated the skill and strategy of the Comanche warriors. Between the time when Texas became an independent republic in 1836 and 1840, they were constantly experiencing Comanche raids. The Texans' desperate attempts, like Moore's expedition in 1839, were clear signs of their ongoing struggle to find a way to manage the problem, one that wasn't going to end with an easy victory. Meanwhile, the Comanche had been carrying out raids for decades, striking fear into the hearts of Spanish, Mexican, and Texan settlers. Thousands of lives had been lost to the fierce Comanche, and the Texas government, under President Mirabeau Lamar, was running out of solutions. The raids, while devastating, were also a sign of the resilience of the Comanche people, who refused to bow to the newcomers. But in late February 1840, a pivotal moment arrived. 3 chiefs of the Panatica, the southernmost band of the Comanche, entered San Antonio to negotiate peace. This was a historical first, Comanche chiefs seeking peace with the Texas government. In late February 1840, 3 chiefs of the Panatica, the southernmost band of the Comanche, solved that problem for them when they rode into San Antonio, looking to make a truce. It seemed for a moment that the violence might end. The peace talks, however, were not as simple as they appeared. Colonel Henry Carnes met with the Comanche chiefs, and despite the Texans' hopes for a resolution, the peace was conditional. Texas, under President Lamar, was adamant about one thing: the return of all white prisoners held by the Comanche. The Texans would not accept peace without this demand being met. One thing the Republic would not stand for was the keeping of white prisoners by the Indians. Before any peace could be made, Carnes had to make one condition to the Comanche clear. All live prisoners of the Panatica had to be returned to the Texans for there to be any peace. The Comanche chiefs, likely seeking an end to the endless violence, agreed to the terms, even though the demand was heavily skewed in favor of the Texans. This moment marked a shift in the war. While the Comanche may have seen peace as a way to preserve their people, the Texans still viewed captivity and the return of prisoners as key to any negotiations. For a while, the Comanche performed bluff charges, testing the Texans' resolve. But despite their efforts, they couldn't get the Texans to leave their position of cover. Eventually, seeing no point in continuing, the Comanche decided to move on. This act, though it may seem like a retreat, was actually a rare show of mercy. For a while, the Comanche performed bluff charges, but unable to get the Texans to leave the area of cover, they eventually moved on, an act of mercy. The Comanche were always strategic, knowing when to press forward and when to withdraw, never wasting effort when the fight wasn't in their favor. This surprised the Texans, who were not in a position of power. The Comanche, despite having overpowered Texas settlers for years, were now showing restraint. The Texans, however, had little to offer in return. They were not in a position to demand much. It was a brash demand. The Texans were not in a position of power. And yet, despite their weakened position, the Comanche agreed to a temporary truce. After the meeting, they decided to meet again in 23 days, agreeing to a parley, which meant neither side would attack the other during that time. Neither side was to attack the other. Good news for the frontier settlers, especially. For the settlers on the frontier, this was a brief relief from the constant threat of Comanche raids, which had taken a heavy toll on their communities. In just 4 years, the Comanche had taken over 200 prisoners, and the death toll had been much higher. Imagine the impact on a community of settlers when over 200 people, men, women, and children, are taken or killed. In just 4 years, the Comanche had taken over 200 prisoners and murdered far more than that. For context, Texas had a population of roughly 70,000 settlers in 1840. In a modern-day city, that's the equivalent of an entire grade level worth of middle schoolers being kidnapped or killed in just a few years. For perspective, in 1840, Texas had a population of roughly 70,000 settlers. 70,000 is a mid-sized city in the U.S. today. It wasn't just the captivity itself that was terrifying, it was the treatment the captives endured. Comanche warriors were infamous for their brutality toward those they captured. Men could expect torture, often to the point of death. The Comanche were notoriously brutal to their captives. Men could expect to be tortured to death. Women and children, on the other hand, might be adopted into Comanche families, but that didn't spare them from brutal treatment. But that doesn't mean that they were spared unspeakable abuse. Captives often faced beatings, burns, cuts, and worse, an unending cycle of pain and fear. For both those taken and their families, the pain was unbearable. The fear of being taken or losing loved ones was a constant reality. A truce, however brief, would have been a relief for both sides. It offered a chance for both to regroup, avoid further loss, and perhaps find some hope for the future. A truce would truly benefit both sides. For the Comanche, it was a chance to rest and assess, while for the settlers it was a brief period to catch their breath, far from the horrors of constant raids. By the 1830s, the Comanche were decisively gaining the upper hand in their violent exchanges with the Texans. Despite the upper hand, they were not without their losses, both in battle and from disease outbreaks. The Panatica, the southernmost band of the Comanche, were feeling these losses too, but they were not yet ready to seek peace for any other reason than trade. They weren't worn down by the ongoing conflict. They were seeking peace for practical reasons. The losses were not enough to make the Panatica want peace. They wanted peace most likely because of trade. The Panatica were situated directly on the borderlands between the Plains and Texas settlers. Other larger and more powerful bands, such as the Yamparica, Katsudica, and Quahati, were farther away from the Texas-Mexico border and didn't face the same pressures. They didn't need peace. They had a buffer zone between them and the settlers. But the Panatica were living right on the edge of this volatile borderland. The Panatica were right there. For decades, the Panatica had been in close proximity to Spanish, Mexican, and now Texas influence, and this proximity had changed them. They had become addicted to European goods like metal for tools and weapons, and cotton for clothing. Their way of life had been influenced by the availability of these new goods, giving them a deeper connection to the world of trade and diplomacy. They had become addicted to European goods. Metal was great for edged weapons, knives, and pots. Cotton made better clothing than animal skins. The Comanche were still fierce warriors, and their primary weapons were still bows and lances. However, many of them had also started to carry guns, blending their traditional weapons with the tools of the settlers. A temporary truce with the Texans would provide the Panatica with an opportunity to access the European goods they craved, which were readily available from Texan traders. And many Comanche were even starting to carry guns, although their primary weapons were still bows and lances. A truce with the Texans gave the Panatica opportunities for trade beyond what they would get in other circumstances. What the Panatica didn't care about was the Texans' demand for the return of their captives. Peace with Texas would allow them to continue their raids in Mexico, just as they always had. Giving up the white captives wouldn't be a major loss for them. After all, the Europeans had always paid a high price for captives before. They didn't care that the Texans wanted their captives back. Peace on the border would be good for them, and they would still raid into Mexico, just as they always did. They would still be able to take captives from them. Giving up the white captives wouldn't be a big deal. Besides, the Europeans had always paid a high price for them before. When the Panatica arrived in San Antonio on March 19, 1840, for peace talks, they came with a delegation of 65 Comanche, 33 warriors, including 12 chiefs, and the rest were women and children. The leader of the delegation was a chief named Speartalker. When the Panatica arrived to meet the Texans on March 19th in San Antonio, they did so with 65 Comanche. A chief named Speartalker led the procession. The Comanche chiefs were coming with a strong showing, and this meeting was a symbol of their desire to open up a path to peace and trade, while still holding firm to their warrior traditions. When the Comanche set up their camp to meet the Texans, there was an immediate realization among the Texans. They didn't bring the number of captives they were expected to. Only 2 individuals were handed over, a Mexican boy and, most notably, Matilda Lockhart, the 16-year-old girl who had been kidnapped years earlier. Before the meeting, the Comanche handed over the 2 captives to the Texans as a gesture of good faith. This was, however, a critical mistake. The Comanche had misunderstood the nature of the exchange. They had expected the same treatment for their captives, the return of prisoners in the same manner that Matilda Lockhart was returned. But this was not the case. Tragic miscalculations would soon lead to devastating consequences. Before the meeting, the Comanche handed the 2 over to the Texans as a sign of good faith. That was a mistake. The Texans, upon seeing Matilda, were horrified and infuriated by what they saw. Matilda, once a vibrant young girl, was now a mere shadow of herself. She had endured unimaginable suffering. Years later, a settler who was present in San Antonio, Mary Maverick, recounted Matilda's condition in her memoirs. The images Mary painted in her writing were grim. Matilda's body was covered in bruises and sores. She had lost weight drastically, and the most horrifying detail, the Comanche had burned off her nose. Mary described her whole body as being full of bruises and sores. Matilda was emaciated, and most notably, the Comanche had burnt off her nose. This vivid and haunting imagery highlighted the brutality Matilda had faced during her captivity. But her trauma didn't end there. When Matilda spoke with the Texas commissioners, she described the horrors she had suffered under the Comanche, the constant beatings, the physical torment, and the emotional toll that it all took on her. Matilda even recalled the events of the 1839 attack on Speartalker's camp, when Colonel Moore's company attacked. She remembered hearing her father's voice calling out for her amidst the chaos. Her father's voice, once filled with hope, was drowned out by the sound of the Comanche warriors, who screamed over her cries as they carried her away. Matilda described to the Texas commissioners what it was like to have been with the Comanche, how she was constantly beaten, how when Colonel Moore's company had attacked in 1839, it was Speartalker's camp. She was present, and she had heard her father calling for her. One of the most painful truths Matilda shared was the constant fear she lived with. When the Comanche were near a Texas town, they would burn the bottoms of her feet, ensuring she would never attempt to escape. The Comanche, in their cruelty, believed this would keep their captives from ever trying to run. She talked about how, when a Comanche village was close to a Texas town, they would burn the bottoms of her feet to prevent her from trying to escape. Matilda also used a term that resonates deeply with those who had endured such horrors. She spoke of how she had been utterly degraded, a phrase that carried layers of meaning, one that echoed in the lives of many who had suffered through such treatment. The phrase, utterly degraded, was well understood by those who lived on the plains. It symbolized the loss of honor, humanity, and dignity. She said that she had been utterly degraded, a coded phrase well known to those on the plains. To the Comanche, the treatment of captives was simply normal. This was the way they would expect to be treated if they themselves were ever captured. For the Plains Indians, when they captured men in battle, the fate of the captive was almost always sealed: torture and death. It was a brutal reality, but it was part of their customs and a way of asserting power. Trapped between two worlds, they had no choice but to fight or die. They could not afford to surrender. Their fate was locked. Either they would escape or they would fight until the very end. For the Comanche, these practices were not just about survival. They were about strength, honor, and the preservation of their way of life. When they captured a captive, it was a part of the cycle of war, a reminder of the high cost of fighting for freedom. The Comanche knew their own fate was always tied to the battle, no surrender, only resistance. But for the Texans, Matilda Lockhart was a stark reminder of what captivity meant in the hands of the Comanche. She was a living testament to the cruelty endured by those caught in the middle of a war that seemed endless. Her condition was a shock to the Texans, but it also revealed something far deeper. The Comanche hadn't followed through on their word. They had only brought 2 captives to the meeting when they had promised more. Before the meeting, Matilda had told the Texans that she knew of at least 15 more prisoners and had overheard Comanche warriors discussing plans to ransom them. This revelation stirred up anger and frustration, as it became clear that the Comanche were not honoring their word. Matilda told the Texans that she knew of at least 15 more prisoners and that she had overheard the Comanche talk about their intent to ransom them. For the Texans, these broken promises were unbearable. According to their European customs, they believed they had sovereignty over all people within their claimed lands. In their eyes, the Comanche were no exception. They believed that the Comanche should be subject to their law and could be punished if they did not comply. This belief in the power of law came from their own history, one where they tried to impose their system of control on all who lived in the area they claimed. Under European custom, they believed themselves to have sovereignty over all the subjects in the land they claimed. They believed that the Comanche were subject to their law and could be punished in accordance with it. In response, the Texas commissioners were given orders to arrest the Comanche chiefs if they did not present the prisoners they had agreed to return. This was a crucial moment. The Comanche, of course, would never have seen themselves as bound by the laws of anyone but their own people. For them, to be held captive would mean nothing less than fighting to the death. The Texans failed to understand that the Comanche did not live by their rules. They lived by their own codes of conduct, bound by their own laws of survival. These were the unspoken rules that governed every interaction between the two peoples. The Comanche, not surprisingly, would not have viewed themselves subject to any law outside the customs of their own tribe, and being held prisoner would mean a fight to the death. This is where the first major meeting between the Texans and the Comanche took place, a moment charged with tension, deep cultural differences, and conflicting beliefs about law, sovereignty, and freedom. On the night of March 19, 1840, the Comanche and Texan delegations were set to meet in a 1-story limestone building near the San Antonio jail, known as the Council House. While the Comanche women and children roamed freely outside, their laughter and activities seemed to signal peace, with no indication of the violence about to unfold. The Comanche boys even entertained the locals, showing off their skill by shooting coins into the air with their toy bows. Inside the council house, however, the tone shifted dramatically. The 12 Comanche chiefs, each painted and adorned with their war colors, sat solemnly across from the Texas commissioners. Leading them was Spirit Talker, a figure of great importance among his people. Despite the calm demeanor outside, the tension inside the room was palpable. The Texans, through their interpreter, immediately addressed the central issue. Why had the Comanche brought only 1 white captive to the meeting? This was not the agreement they had made. Spirit Talker responded, explaining that he had brought all the captives from his camp, as promised. However, he had no control over the other camps, where more captives remained. He assured the Texans that the other chiefs would likely be willing to release the captives for ransom, and spoke of the goods that might be exchanged. Then, with a defiant and pointed tone, Spirit Talker famously asked, "How do you like that answer?" His words, direct and unyielding, were not just an explanation, they were a challenge. The tone of his statement underscored the deep tension between the two cultures. For the Texans, who expected to be in control, it was an uncomfortable reminder that the Comanche were not merely submitting to their demands. Spirit Talker's response was more than just a negotiation tactic. It was a declaration of strength, a reminder that the Comanche would not be bullied or easily coerced into complying with terms they did not agree with. This exchange marked the beginning of what would soon escalate into violence. The calm before the storm outside was shattered, as inside the council house, the diplomatic process unraveled quickly. Spirit Talker's words, and the failure to meet the Texans' expectations, would soon lead to the tragic confrontation that followed. The Texans' demands for the return of captives would not be met without consequence, and the breach of sacred customs, violating the sanctity of the council house, would prove to be a pivotal moment in the ongoing conflict between the two peoples. Inside the council house, the tension could be felt in the air, as the meeting between the Texans and the Comanche took an unexpected turn. The Texans moved quickly, with soldiers entering the room. The Comanche, unable to understand the language of the white men, were left confused. In their culture, a council meeting was a sacred space, free from violence. To break that sacred trust was unthinkable, as it would render their spiritual power, what they called their medicine, ineffective. The Comanche believed they were safe within this protected space, where agreements and diplomacy were upheld with respect. The Texans, however, lacked such customs. Their belief in their superiority led them to view the Comanche as savages, and so they felt justified in taking any action they deemed appropriate. An interpreter was ordered to deliver a harsh message to the Comanche chiefs. They would be held hostage until all white captives from Comanche camps were returned. The interpreter, aware of the potential consequences, hesitated. He knew that this message would incite immediate retaliation, with the chiefs prepared to fight to the death rather than submit to such demands. Having once been a captive himself, the interpreter understood the gravity of the situation. Reluctantly, he conveyed the message. As soon as the Comanche chiefs understood, a loud war whoop rang out, signaling the fury that was about to be unleashed. Spirit Talker, acting swiftly, rushed to a guard at the door and stabbed him. Chaos erupted. A cry for the soldiers to fire was heard, and in moments, the council house became a scene of slaughter. Gunshots, smoke, and screams filled the air as both Comanche and Texans fell. The violence inside the council house was a tragic result of cultural ignorance and the violation of sacred customs. For the Comanche, this was more than a battle. It was a moment of profound betrayal. The sanctity of their customs had been shattered, and it would never be forgotten. As the sounds of gunshots and screams echoed from within the council house, the Comanche women and children outside immediately understood the betrayal that had occurred. They had been deceived. In a swift reaction, they ran to arm themselves, aware that their safety had been shattered. Even before the full scale of the violence became clear, one tragic moment unfolded outside the council house. A judge, who had been casually flipping coins with a Comanche child, was struck by a small arrow to the heart from the boy's toy bow. This was no longer a peaceful exchange. The betrayal was now undeniable. But the battle was not one that favored the Comanche. In the city streets, they were at a distinct disadvantage. Unlike the open plains where their warriors excelled on horseback, here they were trapped, grounded. The narrow, winding streets of the town were no place for the Comanche, who were masters of the wide open spaces, fighting with the speed and power of their horses. On foot, they were out of their element. Meanwhile, the Texans, outnumbering them, quickly surrounded the town. The Comanche, overwhelmed and out of options, found themselves caught in a deadly trap. Some tried to flee, but they were gunned down as they ran. Others, including the women and children, fought back fiercely, holding their ground as warriors, unwilling to give up without a struggle. Their bravery shone even in the face of certain death. 2 Comanche warriors barricaded themselves in a nearby home, hoping for a moment of reprieve. But the townspeople, relentless in their pursuit, used turpentine to set the building aflame. Forced out by the fire, one of the warriors was shot, while the other met his end with an axe. Not a single Comanche survived the onslaught. This scene of devastation is a tragic reminder of the brutal realities faced by the Comanche. It wasn't just a battle of weapons. It was the systematic destruction of a people who had long stood strong in the face of invasion. The attack on the Comanche here wasn't simply about a military confrontation. It was an attempt to erase their way of life, their honor, and their culture. No one was left alive to tell the story of those who fought for survival. This was a massacre, not a fair fight, and it would be remembered for generations to come as another dark chapter in the ongoing struggle for survival and justice. When the violence finally ceased, the toll was staggering. 33 Comanche, including Spirit Talker and 11 other chiefs, lay dead. Another 32 were imprisoned, thrown into the harsh confines of Texas jails. On the Texan side, 7 had been killed and 10 others were injured. This brutal clash would come to be known in Texas history as the Council House Fight, a moment that would spark even greater hatred and violence between the two peoples. The morning after the massacre, the Texans sent a harsh message to the rest of the Comanche. One of the female prisoners, still living, was sent back to her people, riding on horseback. This was a grim signal to the Comanche. Release all white captives, or those they held would be executed. The Texans gave them 12 days to comply. Upon hearing of the slaughter at the Council House, the other Comanche bands were filled with fury. For them, the Council House had been a sacred space, a place where diplomacy and peace were supposed to rule. To violate that was an unforgivable betrayal, an attack on their very spirit. In their sorrow, they cried out, wailing and cutting themselves in ritual mourning. The pain of the loss, the violation of their customs, drove them to an overwhelming rage. Their grief turned into action. The Comanche who had been taken captive, including 13 children, were brutally tortured and executed in retaliation. At least one of the Putnam children, who had been captured alongside Matilda Lockhart, suffered a similar fate. Some of these captives had been adopted into Comanche families, but even they were not spared. In an act of vengeance, some of the captives were roasted over a fire, a stark reflection of the fury the Comanche felt for the treachery of the Texans. These were acts of women, who carried out these brutal rituals as part of their own tradition of justice. The Comanche men, with their thirst for revenge, rode out in search of further violence. Outside the more defensible towns, Comanche warriors launched a series of devastating raids. Settlements were attacked with relentless force, and for months, Texans on the frontier lived in constant fear. Many were killed, their homes razed. The blood feud between the two peoples had escalated beyond control. The Texans, despite their military might, were caught in a vicious cycle. With no peace talks or negotiations left to offer, there could be no respite. The Texan militias did their best to chase off the Comanche raiders, but the Comanche were elusive, skilled in tactics that kept them one step ahead. And the Texans knew better than to chase too far north, where the terrain and the warriors were even more dangerous. By the early summer, the raids had ceased, and the Texans allowed themselves a brief moment of relief. For a few months, the terror stopped, but this fragile peace did nothing to heal the wounds. The Comanche had not been defeated. They had only retreated temporarily, leaving behind a people scarred by betrayal and loss. By late July, Buffalo Hump, one of the principal war chiefs of the Comanche since the Council House fight, had gathered 1,000 Comanche, including 400 warriors, on the Edwards Plateau at the very edge of Comancheria. Buffalo Hump, the cousin of Spirit Talker, had a vision that would ignite the fury of his people. In that vision, he saw vengeance. He saw the Comanche driving the Texans to the sea, sweeping through every settlement in their path. He envisioned a massive raid that would make the Texans feel the full weight of their betrayal. This vision was not just a dream, it was a call to action. The Comanche had endured so much, and now Buffalo Hump was determined to ensure that the Texans would pay for their crimes. By early summer, the raids had stopped, but only because Buffalo Hump had sent messengers across the Buffalo Plains, calling for reinforcements. He was not acting alone. He knew that this raid had to be more than just a few warriors. It had to be a war that would shake the very foundations of Texas. But despite the urgency of his vision, many of the northern Comanche bands, those living far from the reach of Texas encroachment, were hesitant to join. They had lost many leaders during the earlier conflicts, and now had to rebuild trust. Buffalo Hump, however, was undeterred. He knew that despite the odds, they would rise together for this final campaign. On August 1st, the Comanche War Party, with their women and children in tow, indicating they planned for a long campaign, began their march toward Texas. The inclusion of families made it clear that this was not a short-term raid. Buffalo Hump intended to wage a relentless war against the Texans. As the war party moved toward the Gulf, they were careful to avoid San Antonio, aware that the city was a dangerous place well defended. Instead, they targeted the more vulnerable settlements to the southeast, easier to attack with less defense. Their movements were deliberate, but they did not escape notice for long. On the night of August 4th, the Comanche camp, now numbering around 1,000, passed near the city of San Antonio, undetected. But such a large group could not remain hidden forever. The next day, Texans discovered the trail of the Comanche. A war party of that size left a significant path, far too wide to remain unnoticed. The Texans, experienced in dealing with raids, quickly realized what was coming. Ranger Captain Ben McCullough acted swiftly, rallying the militias and calling on the frontiersmen to prepare for the impending threat. Captain McCullough believed the Comanche had passed through 2 days before. This mistake would later prove costly. Though the Texans were aware of the approaching danger, they miscalculated the timing and allowed the Comanche to slip further into their territory. This would come to haunt them as they prepared for a confrontation that was rapidly drawing near. By August 6th, Buffalo Hump and his war party had reached the town of Victoria. They arrived with the weight of a promise in their hearts, a promise of vengeance. The town, unprepared for what was coming, was caught completely by surprise. Historian Fehrenbach described the scene vividly, saying that had the Comanche charged into the town with their full force, there was no question they could have wiped out the entire population. But that was never the Comanche way. Buffalo Hump's warriors, seasoned by years of battle, didn't rush into battle blindly. They circled the town like a bison herd, seizing horses and cattle and creating chaos. For a day, they taunted the people inside, playing a dangerous game of fear and intimidation. They didn't need to storm the town immediately. The panic and terror they created was enough. The people of Victoria were left in suspense, unsure of when the attack would truly begin. As the Comanche continued their raid, they claimed more than 2,000 horses and mules. The warriors, now brimming with excitement, knew the value of the spoils they had taken. It wasn't just about the battle, it was about what came with it. The plunder was a symbol of their success, a tangible reminder of their strength. Buffalo Hump had always planned for this to be more than just an attack. It was a message, and the goods they collected were part of that message. On August 7th, the war party continued their march down the coast. As they moved, the Rangers, led by Ben McCullough, followed their trail. What they found shocked them. In the aftermath of the raid, the people of Victoria had suffered. Around 15 people had been killed. The Rangers, now faced with the brutal aftermath, were left to bury the victims. This wasn't just a fight. This was a reckoning. The Comanche, led by Buffalo Hump, showed the Texans the strength of their resolve, and in return, the Texans felt the sting of the vengeance that had been long overdue. The Comanche weren't simply fighting for survival, they were fighting for justice. And as they moved onward, the scars of this raid would continue to shape the journey ahead. On August 8th, Buffalo Hump's warriors reached the outskirts of Linville, a small coastal town just 50 miles from Victoria on the Gulf Coast. Linville, a vital port for shipping supplies to San Antonio, had no warning of the impending attack. The only sign of danger was a distant cloud of dust, which the town's residents mistook for Mexican horse traders. By morning, many were still asleep, completely unaware of the approaching storm. Historian T.R. Fehrenbach vividly describes what happened next. The war whoop of the wild Comanche commingled with the screaming of the women, the crying of the children, and the groans of the dying and wounded. The town was engulfed in chaos. But what followed was an unexpected twist. Many of the townspeople, seeing an opportunity, fled to the boats anchored in the bay. A strange and almost surreal distraction had taken place. The leading men of the Comanche war party, had become preoccupied with trying to figure out how to remove the whalebone corset of a woman they had captured. In this moment of distraction, the townspeople were able to escape to safety, but not without cost. Several of them were cut down by the Comanche as they ran toward the water. By the time the survivors reached the shore, most had managed to reach the boats, and they watched helplessly as the Comanche burned and looted the town. In the midst of the devastation, one man, Judge Hayes, tried to take matters into his own hands. Armed with a gun, which later turned out to be unloaded, he waded into the water, taunting the Comanche, daring them to come and kill him. The Comanche, however, were not interested in engaging him. They saw him as a fool, and rather than attacking, they mocked him. They laughed at his foolishness and ignored him, pretending he wasn't even there. Eventually, Judge Hayes, realizing the futility of his actions, turned and made his way back to the safety of the boats. This scene is a testament to the unpredictability of war. It shows the calmness and strategic thinking of the Comanche in the face of chaos. Their power lay not only in their fighting prowess, but in their ability to instill fear, control the situation, and pick their battles. Meanwhile, the actions of Judge Hayes serve as a reminder that in such moments, individual bravery can sometimes be drowned out by the overwhelming strength and unity of a determined force like the Comanche. By the time Buffalo Hump's war party reached the town and discovered the horses and warehouses filled with goods, any semblance of control he had over his raiders quickly disappeared. What had started as a fierce mission of vengeance began to shift, driven now by the allure of plunder. The warriors, once focused on their retribution against the Texans, soon lost interest in further violence. Instead, their attention was fully consumed by the wealth around them. This was not an unusual turn of events for Comanche raids. While they were warriors at heart, their raids were often as much about taking what was theirs as they were about defending their people. As they scoured the town, they found objects that were of little practical use to them, suit jackets and umbrellas, but also valuable items that would help sustain them and further their power. Their focus had shifted, and they were no longer just fighting, they were seizing opportunities. Though the war party had already reached the coast and killed many Texans, they now found themselves aimless, with no more clear targets. Their purpose was no longer about revenge. It had been fulfilled, but now they were simply collecting. With nowhere left to go and a massive pile of loot, it seemed the warriors were in a state of confusion. Buffalo Hump, seeing this shift, made a decision. We'll never truly know if he felt the vengeance against the Texans was fully satisfied, but after a day of looting, he gave the order to return to the plains. The loot and captives were strapped to stolen mules, and the once thriving herd of horses, now swollen to 3,000, began its slow trek north toward the plains. The mission had come full circle, with revenge carried out, wealth secured, and the war party now moving on to the next chapter of their lives. The return to the plains was not a retreat. It was a strategic decision, a moment to regroup and carry the spoils back to their people. As the Comanche war party ravaged Linville, their moment of triumph was marked by something unexpected. The town was left in such ruins that it would never be rebuilt, a powerful testament to the fury unleashed upon it. But as the Comanche left, the Texans, long outnumbered and driven to avenge their losses, were finally mobilizing. The tide was about to turn. While the Comanche were still focused on the destruction of Linville, Ben McCullough, a key figure in the Texan military, had been tirelessly warning towns and recruiting men for what he knew would be a decisive confrontation. His messages had traveled far and wide, reaching many, and by August 12th, 200 Texans, Rangers, militias, and soldiers had gathered at Plum Creek to cut off Buffalo Hump and his warriors. The Texans' plan was simple: block the Comanche's retreat and force a confrontation. The Comanche, having become accustomed to splitting their forces to confuse and outrun their enemies, did not take that route this time. This time, Buffalo Hump kept his warriors together, following a more predictable path. Perhaps it was the weight of the plunder, horses, mules, and stolen goods that slowed them down, or perhaps it was a simple matter of strategy. Whatever the reason, they were moving slowly, and the Texans were ready to pounce. As the Comanche approached Plum Creek, they were not prepared for what awaited them. The Texans had arranged themselves into large columns, a formidable sight. The Comanche, however, had their own way of showing strength. Mounted warriors took the lead, shouting and moving around the Texan lines, displaying their intimidating presence. But this time, the scene was less awe-inspiring than it might have been. The Comanche warriors, still carrying their distinctive horn headdresses, now also sported items that were completely out of place on the battlefield: European suit jackets and umbrellas. The sight of Comanche warriors, fierce and battle-hardened, wielding umbrellas amidst the chaos of war, was both absurd and powerful, a reminder of the blending of cultures in a land where both the Comanche and the settlers were fighting to define it. The Texans, outnumbered and caught in a precarious position, knew they had to act quickly. If they hesitated, the Comanche would slip past, and the opportunity would be lost. But fortune favored them that day. In the heat of the moment, a Comanche warrior, perhaps too eager to prove his courage, ventured too close to the Texan lines. Shield raised, he taunted the Texans, calling them to battle. His belief in his own invulnerability, perhaps strengthened by faith in Comanche medicine, led him to think he could not be touched. That belief was shattered when a single shot rang out from the Texan ranks. The warrior fell, dead before he hit the ground. For a moment, silence fell across the battlefield. Then, the Comanche howled in response, the sound echoing through the land. They had believed in their spiritual protections, but the reality of battle had shattered that belief. This was the moment the Texans seized. With the death of the warrior and the howls of the Comanche signaling their loss of faith, the Texans pressed forward, determined to take advantage of the confusion. By the time the Texans began to mobilize, the Comanche had already left Linville in ruins. The town, so thoroughly destroyed by fire, would never rise again. Yet, as the Comanche departed, the Texans were not idle. Ben McCullough, aware that mobility had always been the key to confronting the Comanche, convinced General Felix Houston to change their strategy. Mounted charges would be their answer. By the time the Comanche were discovered on August 4th, McCullough had already sent out messengers and begun gathering more men. He knew that if they were to take on the war party of Buffalo Hump, they would need more men. They could not afford to be outnumbered or outmaneuvered again. The plan was set. They would cut off the Comanche at Plum Creek, a location they knew the Comanche would likely pass after their raid. However, the Comanche, known for splitting their forces to confuse their enemies, did not take this familiar route. Instead, Buffalo Hump kept his warriors together, moving along a predictable path. It's possible that the tremendous spoils they had gathered, the horses, mules, and goods, slowed them down. This gave the Texans their chance. By August 12th, 200 Texans, military, rangers, and militia, had gathered at Plum Creek to stop the Comanche. Among them were some of the most famous rangers, like Ben McCullough, Bigfoot Wallace, and Jack Coffee Hayes. Brigadier General Felix Houston took command of the operation, but wisely deferred to the advice of more seasoned Indian fighters. When the Comanche arrived at Plum Creek, they were not prepared for the Texans' counterattack. Most of the Comanche were preoccupied with managing the horses and mules, which slowed their reaction time. But as the Texans approached in large columns, the Comanche fell back on their familiar strategy. Mounted warriors took the front, shouting and maneuvering to intimidate the Texans. However, this time, the scene was different. The Comanche were no longer solely the fearsome force they once were. Some of the warriors were carrying umbrellas and wearing European-style suit jackets, their traditional war gear paired with clothing completely foreign to their culture. It made the once imposing display somewhat comical, a reminder of the clash of cultures on the battlefield. The Texans, outnumbered but determined, found themselves in a dangerous situation. If they hesitated, the Comanche would slip past, and their chance to confront them would be lost. But fate favored the Texans. A Comanche warrior, caught up in the heat of battle, ventured too close to the Texans' lines, shield raised, taunting them with insults and challenging them to fight. He likely believed that his Comanche medicine, the spiritual protection they trusted so deeply, would keep him safe. But fate had other plans. A shot rang out from the Texas lines, and the warrior fell from his horse, dead. For a moment, silence descended. Then the Comanche howled in anger. The medicine that had once shielded them from harm had failed. This moment of loss and confusion was the opening the Texans needed. In that instant, the Texans pressed the attack, and the Comanche, shaken by the loss of faith in their spiritual protection, began to retreat. For the next 15 miles, the Comanche fled, with the Texans pursuing them and firing as they went. This was no longer a battle for victory. It had become a desperate flight for survival. As they retreated, the Comanche stopped only to kill the prisoners tied to their horses and to discard some of the stolen goods from their mules to lighten their load. Buffalo Hump's great raid had turned into a race for survival, and by the time the fighting stopped, the Comanche had lost much of the loot they had gathered, although the Texans recovered only a few hundred of the thousands of stolen horses. The death tolls of the battle varied. Some Texans claimed that as many as 80 Comanche had been killed, but fewer than 20 bodies were recovered. Despite the confusion about the exact number, one thing was clear: the Texans had won. They had inflicted a significant defeat on the Comanche, but the battle had come at a cost. Several Texans were injured, and one died. After the battle, the Texas government, now emboldened by the victory, pushed for further punitive expeditions against the Comanche. President Lamar called for a policy of extermination, advocating for the complete destruction of the Comanche people. While the Battle of Plum Creek was a victory for the Texans, it only fueled more bloodshed and hatred. The violence, as always, led to more violence. The shift that occurred after Plum Creek was pivotal. The Texans, now more experienced, would continue to improve their tactics in the months ahead. Just 2 months later, in October, Colonel Moore would return to the Colorado River in another punitive expedition. This time, however, he would not make the same mistakes. He had learned from the failures of the past and would be more prepared for the Comanche. After the victory at Plum Creek, the Texans learned valuable lessons about the importance of cavalry charges and mobility in fighting the Comanche. They had seen firsthand how effective a mounted charge could be against the Comanche's famous speed and agility. From this point forward, the Texans would continue to rely on these tactics in their pursuit of the Comanche. But while the Texans evolved, the Comanche made critical mistakes that would change the course of the war. Feeling secure in their own territory, Buffalo Hump and his warriors made the fatal error of underestimating the Texans. Confident that the Texans would not dare to strike deep into their lands, the Comanche neglected to set proper sentinels. This mistake would prove to be their downfall. Colonel Moore, recognizing the vulnerability of the Comanche, attacked swiftly. On this day, the Comanche village, home to about 50 people, was utterly destroyed. Buffalo Hump's warriors, once so fierce, were overwhelmed, and Moore's forces captured 500 horses in the process. This was not just a raid, it was a devastating blow to the Comanche. By the time Moore left the battlefield, the Comanche had lost not only their warriors, but much of the loot they had acquired in previous raids. The Texans, who had fought so hard for victory, now had their spoils. The Comanche, once again, found themselves on the losing end of a confrontation that had been entirely avoidable. In the aftermath of this defeat, the Comanche refrained from launching any further raids on the Texans for the remainder of the year. The loss of both life and resources left them vulnerable. The sting of this defeat would echo for some time, but it was also a reminder of the harsh realities of war.